Ahoy! It's your old buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Night Games. This month, the code is Daylight, and it's good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now all the way through May the 31st. That's right, folks. We've got a long one. It's Daylight, and it's good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now through the 31st of May. And listen, we may have all lost an hour of sleep, but we gained this killer discount code. So when you're thinking about picking up a brand new board game, maybe some Magic the Gathering cards, or an old D&D book you've had your eye on for a while, make sure you use the code DAYLIGHT for 10% off $10 or more, running now through May 31st from our friends over at Noble Night Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. Folks, there's no way I could turn a joke around for Troika. And here's Stu Horvath.
Yeah, it's just too weird, right? Like anything you fire at it's just not going to stick because like it'll grow mushrooms or something.
And you know, I had some mushroom humor. I was thinking about a lot of different things, and like nothing was going to land. Nothing was going to be even like remotely as funny as even the worst joke that I've done in the past. So we're talking about Troika today. How you doing, Stu?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. So what's up with Troika?
So Troika's special is what Troika is. I wanted to do the show because my friend Brian Taylor recently ran me through a one shot of Troika.
Oh, look at us playing games.
Yeah, I know. And it was my first time playing Troika. So like it was interesting to test what my feelings of having read the book and putting them into play. It is just as weird and silly and odd as I expected. You know, it's so strange how the system sort of facilitates the bizarreness of the game. So I guess I'll start by describing the system. It's basically the same system that was used to power the Fighting Fantasy game books back in the day.
Okay.
You know, a handful of abilities, some skills, 2d6. You use a 6-sided die and summit. You could do a 6d66. There's all sorts of weird, you know, of course, there's weird configurations. It's Troika. Most of the time, you're rolling those 2d6 and trying to get the lowest result so that you can get under your difficulty number. Occasionally, you'll be, you know, especially in combat, you'll be rolling those 2d6 and trying to beat your opponent's roll. And that's basically it. There's a very, very, very light skill system. And there you go. That's the system. Like, holy crap. It's 2 dice and a couple, you know, things that you have to track. And you filter everything through your character class. Is that what they call them?
Your guess is as good as mine on this one.
So all of the system is sort of filtered through the character backgrounds. That's the really big thing, that the real draw of Troika is that it supports a myriad of, I don't want to call them character classes because that gives them too much formality. Basically, most of them consist of a brief, evocative description, followed by a list of things that they own, and then any specific skills that they might have that are associated with their past or their profession. So when we played, I was a toy soldier, literally a little toy soldier, like made out of wood.
Okay.
And I specialized in nut cracking.
I mean, that feels like really on the nose, but I'm with it. Yeah.
But the thing about it is that sort of like anything that you kind of say in a Troika game feels like it should just come to pass. So like that turned into a very powerful combat skill over the course of the game. There were a lot of dudes laying around on the ground, you know, groaning in pain
With their nuts cracked?
Yeah. Sometimes it was lethal. And like the physics of it didn't really matter. It didn't really come into play. Like we didn't worry about the relative sizes or anything. It's just like, dude, you rolled great on your nut cracking skill. That guy is in agony. It just kind of pulls and pushes everything around in a way that just keeps it fresh and engaging and fun. My friend Levi was playing what essentially was a Space Marine knockoff. And he was just the combination of tiny toy soldier and gigantic Space Marine was just bizarre. And the adventure that we were playing was we're going through what was basically like those antique stores that have like a whole bunch of consignment stalls? I guess you call them an antique mall.
Yeah.
Sort of like that, except there were like 13 stories. And we had to get my granny's vase that was getting repaired on the 13th story. And like we went through like a whole bunch of shops. There was a knife cult and a giant hummingbird rock. So somebody stole the receipt. They didn't want me getting granny's repaired vase. Brian described the guy as being orange and dressed in orange and blue. And like I said, like whatever you say kind of like makes it true. So Levi was like Alley Viper?
Wow. Yes.
And then, I looked up a picture of Alley Viper. I was like, dude, Alley Vipers are cool. And then Brian's like, yes, now he is an Alley Viper. Like he eventually got impaled on the hummingbird's gigantic beak, which was horrible. But the other nice thing about Troika is the way luck works. It's a little bit like how luck works in Dungeon Crawl Classics. You have a stat. Whenever something happens to you or whenever you want to sort of influence the story, you can check your luck. And if you pass, a good thing will happen. If you fail, nothing happens, or the status quo stays the same, regardless of the result of the roll. If you roll your luck, check your luck, you reduce the stat by 1. So it's sort of like a limited resource. You have to, gauge when you use it. When the rock killed Alley Viper and impaled him and flew off, I rolled my luck. And of course, the receipt that he had stolen from us was just like floating in the air and just needed to be plucked out of the air and put back in my pocket so we could go on with the quest. Just ridiculous stuff like that. And, we tore through the thing in 2 hours. It was a riot of fun and ridiculousness. And that's sort of like the Troika vibe. It's really a very simple system that's flexible, that allows, through the really simple system, the minimal system really does a good job of like putting ideas in your head and just making play really dynamic and weird. And the weirdness is a really specific kind of flavor of British weird. I find it very appealing. I also find it difficult to sort of put my finger on like what it feels like. Ian Miller's work kind of is one of them, but like not necessarily so gothic. There's a psychedelic quality to it, which I think comes out of like as we spoke about before, the sort of the magic mushroom tradition in folkloric Britain has kind of like their cultural output sort of filtered through that in a weird way, especially stuff post 60s. Like even like The Prisoner has something that contributes to the vibe of Troika, like the nonsense that isn't quite so nonsensical on its face, but like feels very weird the more you think about it, but it never acknowledges how silly it is. It plays it very straight because I don't know, maybe laughing would be impolite. I don't understand British people sometimes. So it just has this interesting vibe that I find is hard to place. It makes it really especially unique. That's sold really well just by the way Daniel Sell wrote the book, but also in the way that Dirk Detweiler and Andrew Walter sort of contribute the art that really brings out the strange, hallucinogenic, weird quality of the game. Brings it out in very bright colors for players to kind of like latch onto. You're not latching onto specific things. It's not like Warhammer where you've got like all this lore that you can kind of play with. It's just like it's very free association and you go places that you never expected to wind up. It's a very odd game, but very cool.
So I'm going to take it back real quick. So in my head canon, I'm rewinding because I finally figured out the joke. So it would have went like this. He's the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. He says this would have been David Bowie's favorite RPG, Stu Horvath.
Yeah, Bowie is a really good kind of template to kind of filter Troika through, I think, because he is very not silly, but goes at a lot of strangely colored places that feel hallucinogenic sometimes or psychedelic, but also not. There's a decadence and a weirdness to it.
I would say
richness. Yeah. I think that if you take the entire body of Bowie's work and kind of mush it together in a milkshake and drink it, you'd be well suited to play Troika after ingesting that.
It's very interesting because not to say that people have a stereotypic look when they play Dungeons and Dragons. However, if you were walking down the street and you saw a dude, you're like, that guy plays D&D. and I want to hang out with him because I play D&D too. Troika is something that I don't see coming across a lot of tables. People are playing Pathfinder, playing D&D, playing Call of Cthulhu, playing DCC. But Troika seems a little left of the dial, as it were. Yet every person who I ever encounter who plays Troika is like, this is awesome, because you're painting with a very different kind of palette. And that's kind of why I went with the Bowie thing, because you're right. When you do look at the entire catalog of David Bowie, it goes in a lot of different directions, but never silly, except when Klaus Nomi shows up.
Even then, like, they play it straight is the thing. That Bowie had a sense of humor about stuff, and himself particularly, but never fell for the slapstick, like always played it straight, which makes it funnier and weirder ultimately, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, because when they're on stage together and it's on SNL and Bowie's doing his thing, and then just like right side of the frame, here's Klaus Nomi being Klaus Nomi. Which, by the way, I went to the Bowie exhibit when they had they had this beautiful exhibit for David Bowie at this Brooklyn museum a bunch of years back, and I went, and it was really stunning to see the costumes up close, to see some stuff about the music behind the scenes, and then you round this one corner, and there's the Klaus Nomi outfit, and you're like, oh my god, it's Nomi. I've been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Like I've seen Hendrix's guitars, I've seen the smash bass from the cover of London Calling. I've seen it all. But man, when you're in a dark room and oddly lit by weird light is like the Klaus Nomi jacket, that's something special.
It's very big and boxy, right?
It's so weird. Like, I would be like wearing it. I mean, they didn't let me wear it. I asked. They said no, politely. Didn't try to throw me out of the museum yet. However, when you look at like the sheer size of the person you would need to be just to be able to hold it up without it dragging around like your calves, your ankles, the thing is much bigger than you think.
I think that Klaus Nomi's costume is also like a really good, baseline thing to think about when you're playing Troika, because it just, everything about it just seems like unwieldy and strange. Yet it existed, and like it was used on stage in performance, and like it contributed to this larger tapestry, right? But like it as an object is extremely odd, and intentionally so. And I think that sort of gets at something that Troika is about too, in a weird way.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I'm always like, oh wow, I like this weird stuff now. Like, our palette has changed. Our palette has evolved over the years that we've done the Vintage RPG podcast. And, knowing that when we started out, I had friends be like, well, what happens when you get done talking about TSR? There's only so much, because they're not a company anymore. You find that there's so much more out there, and there's so many different systems and ways to play, and now new and evolving systems and exciting stuff like Troika, which is really weird. And there's like the table that you think that there's only so much room at is actually bigger and almost infinite. Like, you look down, the hallway keeps going, and there's more seats at that table. So it's exciting. It's exciting to have something that is definitely not for everybody. And that said, those who choose to walk this path are going to be richly rewarded with a bonkers game like you had last night.
Another example of how off kilter Troika is the initiative system. Can't talk about Troika without talking about the initiative system. Basically, every character gets 2 chips. They get thrown in the bag, and I think every opponent gets 1 or 2 chips, up to a total of 2 times the number of players. Those get thrown in the bag, and then there's a third chip called the end of round chip that gets thrown in the bag, and you shake the bag and you pull out chips. That's initiative. Whoever's chip gets pulled, they get to attack. So all the monsters could all attack, and then the end of round can get pulled, and your characters never do anything. They just take all those hits. The end of round thing could be pulled immediately, ending the round before anybody does anything. And I think that just gives it a pretty good sense of the idea that anything can happen, that your characters aren't like these tactical goons, like they're D&D, like it's a tactics game, and you're looking to like figure out the best way to crush your enemies, right? It just makes your characters seem like they're like wandering around in a fog, walking into walls in a way that's like really just odd. You got like a bunch of monsters coming at you with knives, and you just kind of like you shrug it off because it doesn't really matter, because it's not like real in the way that like D&D or Warhammer are, like that, where they're just like really grounded in a kind of reality. Troika is like a fever dream, and the way the initiative is set up reinforces that. It's just like it makes it so strange. And combat is very much like, I don't want to say a last resort, but Troika just naturally gravitates towards weird dialogue with characters and places that often short circuits any kind of potential for combat before it begins.
See, I think that's cool, though. I think as far as an initiative system goes, that's actually very exciting, and that is truly random. And it's random, and it's random in a way where it doesn't allow you to game the system, which kind of almost lends it to be more like a real fight, because you might walk around that corner and you get jumped and get your ass kicked, or you might run around that corner and get to jump on the bad guys, or the fight just doesn't happen, or like one of you gets to do something and then the fight ends. Like, I think something like that is really oddly elegant and could be adapted for other types of RPGs, because it does keep it a little more honest. Because, as you know, in a traditional initiative system, you may be the person who has the thing that can solve the problem, but you may never get to go. And you're only not getting to go because you rolled low, and then everyone kills everything before you. So this is cool. I like this.
Yeah. And like, even like a rigid initiative system, like Call of Cthulhu uses like everybody attacks in dex order, which, I mean, it's fine. It's simple. I have everybody in dex order, and if somebody has a pulled gun, I adjust it and everything, and it's fine. We don't have to think about it, but it's not very realistic. Not that Troika is realistic or D&D. Like, none of these things are realistic. They all sort of create effects that simulate a kind of flavor of realism. Most of the time, I think initiative is sort of one of the afterthought systems, but I think that in the context of Troika, the initiative really does a good job of explaining the Troika experience in abstract.
I agree with that. I think I'm now more inclined to play Troika because it does sound like the kind of weird I like. But also, that initiative system it's got my wheels turning a little bit.
I mean, a
little bit.
It would be easy enough to make it more of a standard initiative system. You just take the end of round token out and you go through the tokens as, so everybody gets a chance.
See, I like that, though. I like the end of round token. Like, it's like, well, this happens. This is like such a monkey wrench in the whole thing, because it's like, oh, we're done.
Yeah. That's the other thing, is that it really does shorten combat. And like I've always thought it's sort of like unintentionally hilarious that combat is supposed to be measured in rounds that represent, like, I don't know, like a second or two. And in most D&D systems, D&D like systems, that usually grinds on into like minutes and minutes. And, in fourth edition, I feel like you could have a combat grind out for like hours. So like, just the idea that the simulation takes so long. Troika is the opposite of that. The simulation could be boom, done, and sort of line up with reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool, man. Definitely interesting. It's like such a weird system that I don't know that I have a ton to riff on about it, because I feel like the real thing for me, the real way I could fully see the spectrum of this game, is to play it.
Yeah.
Because there's very traditional or traditional-esque RPG ideas out there that most systems lend themselves to. So, you hear about the cool little dynamics that they have, or like the thing that's their gimmick, and you could just kind of paint around that, because you know how an RPG works. This sounds like there is a decent amount, even though it does use a simple dice system, of nuance that I don't know that I fully grasp as a person who's never played it, who just looks at the covers and is like, wow, that is like a psychedelic 70s album cover if I've ever seen one,
Yeah, it really does come alive and play. Like I said, like I had a good measure of it, having read the rules and a bunch of the supplemental material. I had a good idea of the vibe, but I didn't think that it was going to come out so clearly in play as it did. And it does really spring to life. And the rules really do encourage like strange leaps in logic from everyone involved in my particular playthrough. I should note that Troika is a complete game in the book. You have everything you need to play, a whole bunch of backgrounds, an introductory adventure involving like a very strange hotel and the people who are inhabiting it. So you could just buy the rule book and have fun with it and then go from that hotel. But the sort of the charm of Troika, I think, is just the fact that people have made scores and scores and scores of backgrounds using the framework of the core book, so that, like, you know, there's all sorts of knockoff things and popular things like there's the Seinfeld Troika backgrounds. Acid Death Fantasy is a sort of an official one that introduces a lot of Dune themed stuff, Arabian Nights stuff. So there's options out there.
I mean, friend of the show, Tony Vicinda from Plus One Experience, made a vampire chicken nugget a la McDonald's Happy Meals from like the 80s as a Troika background. I mean, you can get it over on itch.io. I mean, it's crazy because I've been seeing so many people making these backgrounds, and it never really registered to me until like I really had this conversation with you now. And I mean, I know Tony did it like during Zine month, but you really can make anything for this game.
Yeah, the backgrounds are super flexible. There's just enough to them to make them all like gritty enough to have like a mechanical like function, but they're open enough that you could really make anything with them. And people have really been doing their damnedest to test that for the last couple of years. And
a vampire chicken nugget, I think so.
Yeah, and it never breaks. Like it's really kind of fascinating how functional the system is.
Well, that's cool. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Troika?
Friend of the show, Andrew Walter, wrote Fronds of Benevolence. I think that when I read the rule book initially, even with the sample adventure, I felt like, oh my God, I just can't imagine running this. Fronds of Benevolence is a standalone adventure, also from Nelsonian Arts Council, and that was the one that kind of made everything click into place. All my questions were answered except for how does this feel in play, which you have to play to get that vibe. But as much as Troika is a complete system, I do highly recommend getting Fronds of Benevolence alongside it, because I think that it's the spinach that makes Popeye go, you know.
I love it. Well, this is another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I've already posted about Troika and Fronds of Benevolence and Acid Death Fantasy, and you can find a whole bunch of other Troika stuff on there. Nothing coming up, nothing coming down the pipe, but there's lots of Troika content already on the old Instagram feed.
Very cool. You can find me across social media at John McGuire RPG on the Twitter, on the Instagram, and on the TikTok. You can check out 321 Action over at 321actiongames.com, or you can pick up our first adventure, Rocket to Russia, over at Exalted Funeral, because face it, you were going there to shop anyway. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you really like the show, why not become a patron? Patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got early release episodes. We've got a behind the scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. We've got a behind the scenes look at my RPG, 321 Action, plus a brand new pamphlet adventure for free for our patrons coming soon to the Patreon. We got a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.